Welcome back to The Conservative. Hello there, I'm Mike Lennon, your host, and today we're going to spend time talking about the swamp in Washington. And I know you've heard me talk a little bit about it before, but it's getting dark, deep, and dirty. And we need to hear a little bit more about it because I know that the mainstream news is not reporting some of the things that are happening. And to the best of my ability, I'll try to explain the way it's being told to me and the way that I'm being able to go out and read about it. When I say read about it, I mean, as I've said in the past, read both sides because, well, you have to be able to have a side tell about it. Some of the major news outlets aren't saying a thing, so you're not reading anything from ABC, NBC, or CBS. Not in their reading print media, maybe a little bit on their news, I'm not sure, because the last month I have not spent a lot of time looking at those news programs. I've stopped looking at the news right offhand, and I'm listening more to the radio and doing more reading right now, and that's a good thing sometimes because the news is twisted and sometimes not all, and in the limited amount of time that they have, not all that they can possibly show or are willing to show. But if you're following what's going down into Washington, you know that the independent judicial committee brought up by the independent general counsel has now released a page of 3, a paper on the outcome, their view of what happened in the 2016 election, part 1. And part 1 is about the way in which the Clinton emails were handled. Part 2 will be about the piece on which the FBI and or others did not handle the investigation on that travesty. And then I have instantly forgotten as I'm talking here to you about what part 3 is going to be about, but there's a 3-part report coming out from the independent general counsel on what really happened there. I find it very interesting that in the first report he's indicated that there was no political bias towards what was going on in the FBI, and yet everything that most of us as normal, ordinarily reasonable, prudent people see, the folks down there were biased. You've got plenty of written material from one of the FBI agents who is saying to his girlfriend, who is also a lawyer in the FBI, that there's no way that Trump will be elected, and that if he should be elected, they will stop him. Well, if that isn't a bias, I don't know what is. But anyway, a political bias. So that was Peter Strzok, who, as of this broadcast, is beginning to squirm a bit and say that he's more than willing to testify. Well, bring it on, because I'd sure like to find out how in the world a citizen of the United States under subpoena can destroy 33,000 emails, can then bleach them and break them apart and destroy the hardware that's necessary to broadcast or keep that information so that there'd never be any kind of a retrieval. So that's very, very interesting. And everybody that I ever talk to, whether you be on the left or the right, knows that there's no way that there's 33,000 emails from anyone in this country talking about wedding plans or talking about, for that matter, anything. As a matter of fact, I went back and looked at my 10-year record of emails, and I do a lot of emailing, as I'm sure most of you do. And in my record of emailing, I'm lucky if I have 2,000. So and they're not certainly talking about weddings and things like that. They're two friends talking about political things or talking about things that most folks would just as soon not share. And I'm very careful on the internet, as you should be, about what I share. Matter of fact, I learned long ago that to put it in writing is a dangerous place to be anyway, because lawyers can take a writing, and no matter what you say is your intent of that writing, they can spin it, twist it, turn it, and make it look as if it were the worst thing since the devil came up out of hell. So that's what lawyers are paid to do, and that's what they will do if they get a hold of a piece of information that you have written with a completely different intent than what they need that intent to be. Been there, done that, seen it, and I think that you should be very wary of what you write on the internet, what you write on Facebook, what you Twitter, any of those things, because it can come back to haunt you. And in all of these media, unless you are a prolific professional writer, you will misspell words, you will leave out thoughts, you will not go back necessarily and do a 4 or 5 rewrite to get that done, which often gives the president, as well as others, a bad rap, because people are not listening carefully to what he's trying to say, but they're basically reading that little snippet and saying, aha, gotcha. And gotcha statements can be in writing easily. Just to tell you quickly something that's very important, whether a person's writing or a person is speaking orally, an oral speech of some type, there's always a meta message. There are parts left out for whatever reason. Don't want to offend somebody, want to be politically correct, don't want to, or don't know the use of a word, or can't use a word, don't know the definition, don't have a large enough vocabulary, have a vocabulary that's too large, speak too long, speak too short. All those things weigh heavily in the meta message about what you're actually trying to say. Excuse me. So people have to discern what is actually being said and what is not being said, and then add that to your depth of knowledge and try to figure out what it is that is actually being done. So down in Washington right now, you have evidence that at the highest echelons of the last administration, all the way up to Mr. Barack Obama, you have folks that are using emails incorrectly, illegally, using private servers, using servers that are not secured, doing a lot of activity that is forbidden by our own laws, and quite frankly, our criminal activities. And yet they're getting away with those things, and there is a huge stonewall. And as of this broadcast, the initial end of the broadcast, this broadcast is a 2-week-old, or will be before you see another one. They run for 2 weeks, 8 different shows, and then you can get them in the archives, PEG TV. But the indications is that the feeling in Washington is that there was no way that Hillary was going to lose. And if Hillary were to win the election, all of the things that you're now hearing about how she destroyed evidence, covered up evidence, and how the FBI and the FBI higher echelons hid things because they figured that once she was president, it would all go away. And that's what you do when you're doing a government that's corrupt. You keep putting people in that keep the corruption going on. Well, surprise, surprise, at least in America, we still have fortunately, the ability for Americans to make decisions on who they wish to be governed by, and they're not being governed by folks that like other nations where the dictator chooses his own son or his own relative to continue on. And the reason that people do that is at the high end of the tax column, that large end of the pyramid, the upside down pyramid, not the one that goes from here down, but the one that goes up like a normal pyramid. At the top of that pyramid, at the top of the point, is the guy that's running the country, and he is the guy that's making a fortune on the backs of all those people in the bottom of the pyramid. And that is a pyramid scheme, and that's exactly why it's called a pyramid scheme, is that people at the top in the socialistic nations of the world, or the dictatorial nations of the world, the tyrannical nations of the world, the theocracies of the world, those folks at the top are making the money. And the people have absolutely no opportunity below to make any kind of money. What makes America great is that everyone has an opportunity to make a decent living, provided they wish to get the education or do the hard work necessary. And I've talked about this before. You have to have hard work involved in the world of education to be able to have a really great paying job. So that's very, very important to realize that. In the swamp that's in Washington right now, it's a deeper piece than having an education. It's the good old boy system. It's your hand greases my hand, and therefore my hand will grease somebody else's hand. That's called pure and simple corruption, which brought down Rome, which brought down ancient Greece, which has brought down every single civilized nation in the world that has allowed themselves to go to that kind of corruption, i.e. the Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution in 1911, when the czars were overthrown and shot dead in their castle room, the entire family, and that brought that dynasty, that corrupt dynasty, to an absolute end. And then, of course, the socialists began annihilating those who had the ability to think. And you just have to read that history to realize the number of people that died in Russia as the Soviet Union was being built, up to where it eventually fell in on its own corruption, to where we now have another corrupt leader who's going to also cave in. Will Russia continue to survive as that part of the world with its armies and nuclear? Yes, for that amoeba will continue to grow. So will China. So will North Korea. Will they connect with the corrupt pieces that were placed in conjunction with the last 8 years? I don't know that. Nobody can predict that future. Is what Donald Trump is doing as President of the United States right now making it better? Well, it's certainly a lot better than the 50 some odd years that I've witnessed it, where we have been in a contentious stalemate, a non-secured treaty, a war that is only in a ceasefire. That's a very interesting concept that has been there for all these years, and how's that going to play out? Well, that's a tyrant up there, North Korea. It's a democracy, a republic down in South Korea, and the South Koreans are living really per capita pretty darn well compared to their counterpart in the North, where they're starving and they're lucky if they make any kind of a wage or have a decent meal every day. I would think, other than the border, that somehow the communication has to be, and what I mean by border, the inability to see each other, to cross the border, to talk to people. I would think that with this modern day, the events are such that the communication between South Koreans and North Koreans, the general masses, the general public, must be pretty good, just like it is in the theocracy of Iran. The folks in Iran that are at the young millennials or younger, they know what's going on in the world, and that's why you see them on occasion rising up. But it's pretty hard to rise up against your government when you have absolutely nothing to rise up with, maybe a stick or a stone that you can throw. One of the reasons that we cherish our Second Amendment in America is that it gives us an opportunity to rise up should we find ourselves being displaced by a tyrannical government. That is what the Founding Fathers saw in the Second Amendment. That's why the swamp in Washington would love to have you have to give up all of your weapons. That's why they would like to say every time there's a shooting incident that it's the guns, it's the guns, it's the guns. It's not the guns, it's the nut job that's behind that gun that pulls the trigger. Number one, I hope you all look and see that the number one killer in America is not by a gun. If we're trying to take down people, yes, in certain cities it is, certainly Chicago with the greatest gun laws in the nation, with the greatest number of gun murders. That's an exception, because in the rest of the cities, knifings are pretty much the number one way that people get killed in a violent crime, some form of a knife. And obviously, there are more people dying every single day on our highways with a brutal, deadly piece of equipment, the drivers who kill other drivers. And again, the will to actually act. You don't see people marching in the streets and yelling and screaming because a guy that's had 4 or 5 DWIs has now finally killed a family, or killed one, or killed whatever. And I know the pain of a family member and all the family members who never recover. Most of you have heard that story in my lifetime, where my brother was killed 2 weeks before he graduated from college. That was by a drunk driver, head-on collision, 2 o'clock in the morning, just south of Keene, New Hampshire, on his way back to Clark University, with a passenger in the car with him, and his fraternity brothers had all stopped in Keene for a cup of coffee, and those two, my brother and his friend, went on, and about 10 miles down the road were killed by a drunk driver fisherman. Oh, that would have been okay, maybe. Not to say it would have been okay. I mean, the guy was drunk. But that was the 6th or 7th time that he'd been breathalyzed as being a drunk. So here's the question. Why was he still on the road? Why do drunks be allowed to continue to drive? That's the big question, because they are putting other people's lives in jeopardy. And we're going to come up with the same problem with marijuana and drugs and all this other stuff. Once caught on the highway abusing your privilege to drive, the license is a privilege. Once caught abusing that privilege, there should be no reciprocity. There should be no reason why you should be allowed to continue to drive. You should not be given a ability to repent and be allowed to go on. Sorry, that's the way I just look at it. That's my conservative view, is that these folks should not be allowed to drive. Now, that's a conservative view because it's based on my own worldly experience. The family members who are involved in this kind of contentious death never recover. My mom and dad never recovered. Family members that I know in my family structure at that time, my aunts, my grandmothers, my uncles, none of them recovered from that. So there were at least 10, 15 folks who died early deaths, and quite frankly, I think triggered by the emotional impact of that tragic automobile accident caused by a drunk driver. So I go back and I bring that back around to let you know that these are the kinds of things that we have to take and consider when you're talking about, oh, gee, guns should be banned. Well, if guns should be banned, here's the connection. So should drunk drivers. So should drivers of cars. But you don't see people yelling that are drunk. You don't see people yelling and screaming about those folks. And there's a heck of a lot more people dying every day from a drunk driver crashing into them than are dying anywhere in this country from a gun. Yes, gun deaths are tragic, but so are the deaths caused by the car driver, or the deaths caused by abusive husbands, in a rare case an abusive wife, but most of the time an abusive husband, or the deaths that are being caused in this nation by knife. And you can stop the school shootings by strengthening the school security. That's that simple. The swamp in Washington is not going to be willing to do any of that. And I don't care what side of the party that you're on, whether you be a Democrat or you be a independent or you be a Republican. I do not see the will to do what's right by the people of the country. The only person I see down there right now that's giving any kind of an effort to try to make it right for the folks of the country is the President of the United States. I really do believe that he's trying to make a good attempt at trying to change what's going on in Washington. But the status quo, the news media, the elites, the political elite on all parties, Republican, 1 or 2 independents, and Democrats, refuse to make the changes necessary to make this a great nation. Not to say that this should be make the nation great again. The nation has always been great. Can you make it better? Can you continuously improve the process? Don't know, because there doesn't seem to be a will to do it. Now, getting back to that swamp, you have to remember that this guy that I spoke to at the beginning of these things, this FBI agent by the name of, I think his name is Peter Strzok. Peter Strzok is the guy with his political shenanigans, his biases, his trumped, excuse the pun, up charges, instituted Mr. Mueller's investigation of the Russian collusion. And after almost a year and a half now, there has been no Russian collusion because it was trumped up by the Democratic Party, paid for by the Democratic Party. And not only was it not paid for, was it also paid for by the Democratic Party, but it was instituted and chased by them as a false narrative to try to bring Trump down prior to the election. And everybody that reads this stuff knows that 18 months later, if you can't find anything, you've spent $17 million on the investigation, which, by the way, is headed up by 7 Democratic lawyers. There's no Republican lawyer on the Mueller team. That tells me that's a political bias. But there would be no Mueller if there hadn't been a Strzok who had written the exoneration letter with the changes in it prior to Comey saying that she was a basically free woman long before he ever investigated her. When I'm saying things like that, that should trigger in your mind, oh my God, that is really corrupt, okay? You don't free somebody with a get out of jail card prior to them going through the system to find out whether or not they belong in jail. And they did that, okay? You'll recall the visitation of the former President Bill Clinton on the tarmac with the then Attorney General Loretta Lynch. Absolutely corrupt. We would never, ever have known anything about that if it wasn't for a lawyer who decided that he would chase a story of a unique landing in an airplane and get inside that hangar. How he did it, I have no idea, and find out who was boarding that airplane that he knew Loretta Lynch was on. So how he got wind of that and how he got into that hangar, there's one really strong journalist. There's somebody that we'll probably never hear from again because obviously he did a no-no reporting such information. So that's a very important piece of this swamp. And we could talk ad infinitum right now about how in the world the swamp is at work. A deep state swamp that is trying to bring, quite frankly, America down. Now, if you're trying to bring the President of the United States down, that's trying to bring America down. And that's part of the socialistic system, is to try to overthrow the government, to try to bring it down, to try to convince you that the government that you're operating under is a false government and it should not be allowed to exist. That's exactly what they're yelling and screaming about in Washington on the left. And there are some even on the right that are yelling and screaming about the fact that the government is illegitimate right now. It's not an appropriate government. So where that is in the Constitution, not. No such thing as that the President of the United States will be an appropriate president or politically correct president or a president that does it the way the lobby wants it done or a president that does it the way the actual party wants it done. I got a feeling that when President Trump finally retires, he would be very easily, he could stand on a stage and sing Frank Sinatra's song, I Did It My Way, and sing it right there in New York City, because that's what he's doing. He is doing it his way. And quite frankly, within the structure of the Constitution, up to the point that we've allowed that Constitution to expand presidential rights and diminished rights in Congress. Can you imagine not reading the Constitution correctly and deciding as a congressman or a senator that you will give up your most important rights to the president? That's exactly what, or to the judiciary, exactly what the founding fathers warned us about, was to allow the swamp to grow and not hold people's feet to the fire on the constitutional rights and responsibilities, the rules and regulations, policies and procedures that are laid out there. And we don't push for that. Most of us that are sitting here watching my program have no clue what the Constitution of the United States is even all about. We don't bother to study it any longer. We don't bother to make sure that children know what the Constitution of the United States is all about. We're more interested in making sure that they can do whatever it is that they are going to do coming out of school, and that is a bad, bad place for us to be. So the reinstitution of civics as such, the learning of what this great republic is all about, would be one of the first things that I would suggest strongly that every single school in this country return to. Some schools are still teaching it. Some schools have no respect for it. Some schools aren't teaching it at all. Teachers should not be allowed to voice in the classroom opinions one way or the other on any of this. You're supposed to be trying to teach the children to think for themselves. So the presentation of the information wouldn't be that the swamp is terrible because Trump is there, or the swamp is terrible because Obama was there. There wouldn't be, you could teach about the possibilities of corruption in a federal republic as ours. But more importantly, it'd be important that the kids know and understand what the Constitution is all about and why we have a representative government, and the importance of being a citizen, and the importance of voting, and the importance of exercising those political free rights. Why do we even have them? So that we don't have another generation of folks growing up who have no clue why we even have to vote, and why we have less than 30% of all those eligible to vote ever vote. And those are huge mistakes that we could lose instantly, and once lost will never be reinstituted. I can guarantee you that. We're a 250-year-old nation. We lose the freedoms that we have fought up to this time with our lack of interest. We are going to be in deep doo-doo. And once we have that dictatorial power up there running the country, watch what you can't do anymore. And you'd be surprised that everybody sits there at home and thinks, well, that'll never happen. Don't you ever think that it won't happen, because to the best of all of us in the world of politics, it has happened. Don't see the Roman Empire in existence anymore. As a matter of fact, at the fall of the Roman Empire, we had instituted the Dark Ages. Things did not work very well anymore. Things went very, very quickly south, and people had no clue what was going on. People unraveled, and governments that were beholden to the larger government in Rome fell apart. So all of these kinds of things are certainly there for us to consider and be worried about. So trying to come back to the initial beginning of this conversation, you're going to have to do some real reading to understand that we have a serious problem in Washington, D.C. It's very deeply corrupt. We have a judiciary that is only two-tiered, one for the people like you and I sitting here watching this show, and those who are politically elite get away with things that nobody should be allowed to get away with. And that is a danger in a political society that we have formulated 250 years ago. That should not be happening. But my question then would be, what are you sitting on your couch watching this saying, I have little or nothing that I can do about it? What are you going to do? And you have to do things like when I did I was thinking the other day, this is the start of my 9th year on television. And what are you going to do about it? Well, maybe you're going to do a talk show. Maybe you're going to do some letter writing campaigns. Maybe you're going to get up and do some talking yourself to your neighbors. Maybe you'll get up and run for office. Maybe you'll make sure that whenever you have an opportunity to vote, you will vote. There's your biggest hammer right there. And a lot of people say, oh, my vote doesn't count. Yes, it does, okay? In our little community, about 8 years ago, 9 years ago, a candidate was defeated by 1 vote. And that's how close that election was. Made a big difference in how things happened in that particular ward over the next 8 years. So you had a very liberal person that won over there, and they won by 1 vote. And how do you make a liberal's stance change when you, let's say, are a conservative. Well, you have to go out and vote, and you'd have to go out and vote for a conservative. Well, I got to go around and around and around the bush on what a swamp we have going on down in Washington. Please look it up. See me in the grocery stores. Contact this TV stations. If you have any questions, leave them there for my producers, and they'd be glad to pass them on to me. But I do love talking to you in the stores when I come across you, and a lot of people do see me. All right, see you next time. Been glad to talk to you. Bye now.